So my name is Sarah Perry. I will be popping in and out. I am on the Blameless team, part of the team behind the scenes who is helping make this webinar happen. I see some chatter in the chat. So please feel free to put questions or commentary in the chat or the Q&A. We will be monitoring both throughout the event. And from here on, I'm going to pass it over to our real hosts. So here you have Matt Davis, the SRE advocate here at Blameless, and we are joined by a special guest, Ty Wood, founder of Resilience Roundup. So thanks so much, everyone, and I'll hand it over to Matt now.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you, Ty, for joining me today. Really happy to have this conversation today. I'm really excited about it. This is a subject that's close to my heart, and I think it's close to yours too, Ty. So let's dive right in. We're going to talk about how to design an effective on-call program. And what we mean by on-call program, you might call it an incident management program. You may call it an incident response program. It's called all different kinds of things. But one of the questions that we asked, actually getting ready for this webinar, was who does on-call? I think we even talked about how big are on-call teams, and does it have to be a certain amount of, does it have to be a certain size? Does it have to be a certain size company? Does it have to be enterprise? Can a 3-person startup have an on-call rotation? Ty, who is on-call?
Yeah, so to my mind, I think it is common that people say, oh, either we're too small or it doesn't fit right for us if they're on the smaller end or they're on the much larger end, and say, of course it's us. But really, anytime you have something that is live, and if something happens to it, you are going to stop what you're doing and go look at what happened. You have some sort of incident response program in place. It may not be well documented. It may not be shared by the rest of the team, however large that is. But kind of the moment you stop what you're doing and say, oh, I know something happened, I'm going to go attend to it. You are on call. You are participating in managing an incident.
Yeah, I think that I didn't used to think that way. I think I used to think about, oh, well, to do an on-call program, we have to get formalized. We have to have some kind of structure. We have to have some kind of, pager rotation. We have to have all this stuff set up, But really, it's more of an attitude than a procedure. I think that's what you're saying. Because I've been in this position. I've been a solo operations person, and I've been the person on call. And I'm, when I think back to those times when I've been that solo person, I don't know that I thought about, well, how do I want to make my solo on call? How do I want to create this procedure? I just kind of do it as it comes. It's very much kind of a grassroots kind of thing. Do you think that that's where most of the culture of on-call comes from people doing it because they need to start it somehow?
I think that's often the case. I think that maybe this is increasingly, less true, but a lot of folks, they start with what the thing is, and that makes sense, right? If you're launching a startup, if you're even doing an open source side project, if you're doing something, your energy and your time is focused on the thing. It tends to be something that pops up later that we go, oh, now I maybe ran into something. Now what? Or oftentimes when I trained on this stuff as a consultant with different teams, different companies, they'll come to me, or we'll start these conversations. They'll say, well, now we need to get serious about it, is a phrase I hear often. And usually what that means is we had something surprise us. We realized it was difficult to coordinate. Possibly the mechanics of just getting all the folks in the right place was hard. Maybe we didn't know where the right place was, and that interfered with sort of the technical aspect of the response. Those sorts of pains and discovery is, I think, very common.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. Especially in an environment where startups become to be the norm, where it may actually be that those are the people who need the most help. But I also think at the same time, there's another end of the spectrum,
Mhm.
which is kind of the company that isn't necessarily starting off an on-call program like this, but their on-call program is not working.
Mhm.
You know, it's maybe they never organized around it. Maybe they've just gone from that grassroots movement, solo people, a trio of people, up to maybe a team, but you know, it doesn't really fit into the way that the whole organization operates, maybe, or they have to figure out some way to kind of, well, we're going to do this grassroots movement thing in our team, and we're going to bring this good operational excellence to the rest of the company. I've seen that happen too.
Mm.
Have you seen this kind of dichotomy?
Absolutely. I've actually seen it sort of in both directions.
Oh,
I've
okay.
seen that where, we were a startup and we were all sort of maybe well versed in this, and that sort of seeded the ground for it to later expand when that need was met. I've also worked with very, very large companies, like very large internet retailers you've certainly shopped at, where essentially they're so large that different parts of the organization are effectively their own organization. So oftentimes what happens is there's an incident management process documented somewhere, but it talks a lot about uh, how do they define severities? When should we tell executives? How often should we update folks? But they're kind of silent on how do we coordinate? What should I do when I'm awake at 3 a.m. now? Is it okay to wake other people when I'm awake at 3 a.m.? Kind of those sorts of things it's often silent on at these very large companies. So I see the reverse happen, where then that team kind of goes back into itself and says, okay, well, though this larger framework exists for the organization at large, it doesn't really fill our complete needs as a program. So we will develop a practice and then sort of plug it in to the larger org as it makes sense. And maybe as that catches on, maybe it'll spread in that direction, where it actually, that grassroots movement happened actually after the larger organization's formalization process.
Yeah, I think it's so this reminds me of a diagram that Dr. Richard Cook used. This is from 2018. It's not that old. But what we're talking about now reminds me of this, the line of representation. If folks have never seen this diagram before, the stuff below the line, you can think about that as that's what the SREs do. That's what the operations people are doing. That's what the DevOps people are doing. They're doing all of that stuff below the line. Now, what we're talking about today is all the stuff above the line. We're talking about all these different types of people that need to coordinate, like Ty has been talking about, and they're all different. We've talked about grassroots movements of on-call. We talked about an enterprise perspective of what the on-call should be. And then even the different people that are on those different rotations have different ideas about how the system works. So that really brings me to the next thing that I'm thinking about, which is training and practice. Ty, what are some of the good training programs that you've seen or that you've even used to train?
Just for some background and to set some context for folks.
Please.
So many years ago, more years than I care to admit, I kind of stepped away from tech for a little bit, and I actually became an EMT. I later worked in an ER, and I was trained in the local search and rescue program and learned rope rescue. Later, when I kind of returned to tech and did SRE stuff and was an SRE in different organizations, it struck me by just how different sort of incident response in software was, and not just because of the environment, because it's at my computer versus in the ER, but because of how much practice was available to me and expected in sort of the emergency medical environment that isn't really present as much, although I have been seeing that changing in software. So really, I guess the low bar is that practice exists and is acknowledged. I think so often you say, okay, I've seen organizations say, this is the incident response process. Here's the Confluence link. Here's the Google Doc, what have you. We're done. You read the doc and it's kind of assumed or maybe not even thought of that now that I wrote this thing, or executives or whomever wrote this thing and sent it all and to everyone, posted it in Slack, that's training, and that's not. There has to be some sort of environment to practice it in. I've seen folks be really effective with like tabletop exercises. Some people like to make the analogy to D&D. I've seen any sort of simulated type stuff. Some people like to go really advanced as far as chaos engineering, though I don't think you need to get benefit, but really I'm happy to see anytime folks are acknowledging the need for practice and providing the time and space for it.
Yeah, I think that's the key right there, is just acknowledging the need and providing the time and space. This is something that I feel really strongly about. Just like Ty, I have an interesting background that's non-software, and that's music. Music is very much the same way, and if you've seen some of my other webinars, you've probably heard me talk about how jazz musicians do this. They practice. They don't just like write a score and then they're like, okay, we're going to play this score at the performance and not practice it. That doesn't make any sense. There's another great reference in emergency response, and Rude is the last name, and it has to do with Arctic response, and it was specifically a study of improvisation in Arctic response. And what the paper is about is the benefit of practice. That's the whole point of the paper. It's not the fact that improvisation happens, because it does all the time, especially in something like that. But the emphasis of the research was on the practice, and the outcome of the research was, yes, it is absolutely beneficial, if not necessary, to practice these kinds of things. You know what else this reminds me of, Ty, is the idea of work as imagined versus work as done.
Absolutely. I think that's something important that you've touched on, because we talked about there's sort of one view of an incident management program as formalized, as being complete when it's written, as being done when it's documented, and that sort of being the be all end all. And oh, if we agree on, all the possible scenarios or rules or what have you, then we're done, right? There's this view that in developing an incident management program is simply exhausting the space of all the possible scenarios, codifying them, and then distributing that codification. And as you've touched upon, there's certainly room for that codification and some norms and standards in the way we work. Do we practice, together? Do we have in a garage? And it sounds, as a band, how do we practice? and how do we communicate? But as you point out, there is this big difference between that imagining and the way things actually happen, where there is room for improvisation, and you said a requirement for improvisation.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that we do here at Blameless is we have, like we were saying, practice sessions that are supported by the company. This is a grassroots kind of thing. It absolutely is. It started from our infrastructure SRE team. But the whole company is invited to the session, and it's been going for a year and a half now. And it's something that the company has just got behind and allowed us to have the time. And it's an official part of people's schedule. People make time to come to this. We do an 80-minute session every time. So it's really beneficial. I can't really underline this enough, to make it a habit. It's the iterativeness of it that helps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if I could just tell a story to get help
Please
folks
do.
understand, when we talk about practice, I think that sometimes that can seem a little bit large, or a little bit daunting. What if I don't have that 80 minutes? And I think that most folks could grow to it, but I've seen practice in, say, emergency medicine be as simple as, when you get certified, you basically go through school. The government sends you a little patch when you're done, and you are officially certified by the federal government. The interesting thing that happens in most 911 services, when you actually go to be on an ambulance to respond to real emergencies for the first time, even though you have this federal certification, even though the US government said you are ready, your school said you were ready, you've graduated, they actually pair you with a field training officer for a week or two, because they're going to tell you how things work in that context. And so what they'll do, my favorite example of practice in that context is, so with one of your first calls, oftentimes you'll have to kind of call ahead to the hospital using the radio, let them know what they're expecting, which is something we kind of like to do in software as well. Get a hold of some of their team, let them know something. But what happens, I've seen it happen over and over and over, is that folks who are new or haven't really used the radio before, they go, oh, okay. And they go to key up the mic and they stop, because in that moment they realize they're in the situation, but they don't feel like they know what to say. They all of a sudden realize that there is some sort of, lingo or cadence or something that they're expecting, and they realize they don't quite know what to say. They don't know how detailed they should be. They're perfectly capable of explaining the medical side. They've been through school, but in that moment, just even having to say it on the radio, they freeze up. And what I've seen a number of FTOs do, field training officers, is they'll reach into their pocket and they'll pull out this laminated card, and it has some phrases and some little blanks to tell you what to say in that moment. And so that's the level. Practice can be in that moment. It can be 1 minute. It could be carrying around that card and looking at it throughout the day, or it can be an 80-minute session.
Yeah. I love the aspect of this that really made me kind of chuckle, was that practice isn't just about understanding what all the failure modes are. You heard Ty say a little bit ago about how some organizations think that, well, if we build an on-call program, what we have to do is we have to enumerate every single failure and then build our on-call program to encapsulate all of those failures. Well, that's impossible. You can't do that. But you can do things like practice what to say on the radio. When we get into these sessions every week, we're a fully remote company, okay? We're fully distributed, so we don't have an office. And so when we get together every week, this is a chance for us to be together. It's not just a chance to practice, it's a chance to be together. So when you're together, a lot of really awesome things happen. You remember learning better when you're learning in a group environment. There are just signals that help your brain put those patterns together, and you recall those things better. And it helps us do things like someone doesn't know how to use Zoom. I mean, or someone doesn't know how to, Zoom is a perfect example actually, but I was going to say someone doesn't know how to open the observability, programs that we use. But, using the radio and using Zoom are very, very close together, because when you get into an incident, the idea here is um, you're practicing so that when you get into the incident, it feels a lot more natural. It feels a lot more aligned with your intuition, and it's something that you don't have to think about. And that's what practice sessions can do. They can, and just like in jazz and music, they're not thinking about what they're soloing. They're just soloing. They're just playing together, and they're just collaborating. Really excellent story. I love that aspect of it. Thanks. Let's talk a little bit about command and control. And I'm gonna start us off here with a model that was proposed by Dr. Laura McGuire called adaptive choreography. Now, this is only one way to look at command and control. This is the way that we look at it at Blameless, and I know there's some other teams out there that do a very similar thing. Let me give you a really quick overview. In the adaptive choreography type of incident response, you do have a incident commander, but they're not directing everything. They're not micromanaging decisions. They're not instructing people what to do. They're there to carry the response. They're responsible for the response. They allow those problem solvers to make their own decisions in that little closed loop right there, be flexible with their own decision making, be flexible with their own troubleshooting, but still feed into the commander, because the commander feeds into the communication side of things, the stakeholders, the customer, the managers or whatever. So just a little bit about that. Ty, how important is this? So I'm thinking about coordination costs. I'm thinking about things like dogpiling an incident, like too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing. I'm thinking about in a distributed environment, how we're not able to be in the same room. What do you think about this idea of adaptive choreography?
It's super important because when we think about command and control, we can kind of think along sort of a continuum, right? On one far end, we have that sort of micromanaging that you mentioned, like, oh, the incident commander is here to tell person A to do exactly this. They might as well be typing it themselves. Like, it would be fast. Like, that's the extreme end of command and control, right? On the opposite end of that, at that extreme end on the opposite side, is everyone just does whatever they want, and they don't talk to anyone or tell anyone. Those are both sort of the extreme ends of that, right? Where where we trade off through that space, though, are the coordination costs, right? Because obviously, we don't want everyone to run off on their own. That's kind of not really useful. If I discover something, I should probably tell you. But the more we move around there, we're trading off those coordination costs, right? How much do I tell you? How involved do you need to be? That sort of thing. And so this idea of adaptive choreography, I think, helps folks sort of calibrate for themselves very well. And I'm partial to this diagram, and I appreciate Dr. McGuire for making it, because it's also arguably a diagram of what I suggest for folks to do if they say, look, we're new, we need some sort of program. How does it work? Like, what is it? If someone joined this webinar today and they said, I'm looking down the barrel of having to have this thing. What is it? And to me, it's three roles at the most, often the simplest is that you start off with, if you are the person paged, surprise, you are occupying all three of these. I tend to
That's
think of it
true.
as three hats. You want to give two of them away as quickly as possible. You elect someone to, help you with the communication, and then hopefully some local expert to help you with the problem itself. So I think this model serves, and this diagram serves a number of things. It reminds us about how we kind of calibrate on that coordination cost. As you said, if we really sort of weight that bottom of that triangle, it's really hard for that person who's towards the top to really get insight into what's going on there. Whereas if it's too sparse down in there, well, that person who's sort of at the top, they don't want to delve into that realm, so it's hard for them as well.
Yeah. This is something that we see at the beginning of incidents. This can sometimes be the most confusing point of the incident is getting together. And I think that the way that Ty just described that of how someone has gotten paged, that the first thing that we want to do is to get help. And that can be hard for people. That can be hard for someone who, for example, knows exactly what to do to fix the defect. Now, that's all good, but there might be other things that are connected to them knowing how to repair this that need to be taken into account. Other things that are going on. Are there releases happening? Who is even available? Are there other incidents happening? All of these other contextual things are really important. So get help early. And that's something that I say a lot too, is if you question if you need help, you need help. And just get help and just ask for help early. And in fact, ask for people's advice before you actually need their help. Like if you might need, let's just use a simple example, like a DBA. You may not need the DBA yet, or you may just maybe signal them and go, hey, I have a question. I might need you in like 30 minutes, but can you tell me where to look for this? And give them a little bit. And this goes back to that kind of transparency of communicating up and being able to kind of, be transparent about things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's actually something that I think practice helps as well, right? Because if we've practiced together in some way, whether it was we all sat at a tabletop, we had, that the Gamelin practice, it's going to be a lot easier for me to do that signaling to you, because you're going to know at least something about me and I'm going to know something about you. It's going to be a little bit easier for me to craft a message that you're going to hear, and it's going to be a little bit easier for you to understand what I'm saying. Perhaps in our working together, you get the sense that maybe I don't tend to ask for help as much. Well, when you read that, you can begin to anticipate that perhaps 30 minutes is 20 or 25. On the other hand, if you've, through our practice, learned that I tend to adhere to that, well, then you get some other layers to this message, and that signaling becomes more effective because of that common ground we were able to build during our practice sessions.
I'm so glad that you used the term common ground, because our next topic here is poised to adapt. And common ground is a lot about this, and vice versa. And what
Hey,
do we
Matt,
mean by poised to adapt?
we have one question on command. Do you mind if I pop in and ask
Oh
that
yeah,
before we
sure.
move
Go
on?
ahead. Yes, of course, please.
Yes, so we have a question from a guest. Hello, I'm still not entirely clear what the command role does.
Well, I skipped right over this slide because I was going fast, but I'm going to go back to it. Thank you for that question. That is an awesome question. So I know we were talking very theoretical about adaptive choreography, but technically, tactically, I should say, what is it that the incident command does in adaptive choreography? So, it's a little bit of an overseer role. The things that you see here are all about owning the response and not the incident. So, for example, the incident commander is not the person who's digging into observability. The incident commander is not the person troubleshooting, even if they know the system. And this is really hard for some people, especially the SMEs that double as commanders. They have this big tendency to want to solve the problem. But that's not what the incident commander does. The incident commander is there to help analyze, to help guide, to help see a more broad picture, so that they can help others see that more broad picture. Synchronizing activity is a really important part of incident command. So, I just mentioned, is there a software release going on? Well, incident command, hopefully, has a way to know that. And so they might have to go, okay, developers, please halt all release activity. We are in an incident now. We have to release a hotfix. That's an example of synchronizing activity. And delegating roles we talked about. That's really important. Now, like we said, the initial contact might not be an incident commander. It might just be, an on-call person. But the very first thing that person wants to do is to think about escalating and getting help. And that's what the very first person that can help them do that is the incident commander.
Yeah, to speak a little bit more about the sort of tactics, like I like that you listed an example of what they might do. The incident commander might notice that, oh, this SME I have seems to be really bogged down. They're digging into the system that maybe they're familiar with, maybe they're not, but for whatever reason, it's really hard for them to get answers right now. And my communications person is telling me that other stakeholders have questions. Well, the person who's busy digging into that, it's really hard for them to sort of surface and answer that and do this other stuff. Whereas the incident commander can sense this, see this, happening, and say, okay, it's time for us to bring someone else in so that we can field these other questions that we're getting, or sense that maybe no note's too early yet, so that we don't end up with too many people in it. It's that's something they might do, or they might say, we have two people digging into separate things. I haven't heard from someone in a while. Let me check on them, make sure they didn't get stuck somewhere, that something didn't happen. If you're a phone bridge type company, then are they still leaving on the bridge? Did they lose Wi-Fi? Did something happen? Someone to sort of have that overall view and sort of connect the dots, so that those folks who are experts in the local area can focus on that. And then the commander can help, know, do we have the right resources? Do we think we're in the right place? Is there some other incident? If you ever had like, oh, we didn't realize we were working the same incident 3 times, because 3 different teams, hopefully there's someone who has a broader picture view and can say, let's connect these things.
Yeah. Being able to see, like, maybe if you're in a larger organization, the API team has an incident, the database team has an incident. Incident commander is the one that's going to be able to connect those two. The other thing that kind of falls under the guide part of this that Ty alluded to is the human aspect of responding to incidents. This is something that the incident commander has the best ability to see. Noticing if someone is not checking in, noticing if someone has been working on an issue for 6 hours, encouraging people. I'm saying the incident commander can be encouraging people to make sure that they give statuses. So they can say things like, I'm tired, or I'm hungry, I haven't eaten in 8 hours. Like, that's another part of this that's really, really important, is to not forget that there are humans with real human needs and human challenges operating the incident. I hope that helps answer the question of what incident command does. Now,
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Any other questions? Thanks for putting up that link too in the chat, Sarah.
Yep, no further questions here. Good to move on.
Okay. So we're poised to adapt. We're sharing common ground. We're repairing common ground. We talked about incident commander responsibilities. Well, let's quickly show you, what does that little loop of people doing the OODA loop, the localized responders, the SMEs, they're doing these kinds of things. You can think about it as these are the things the IC does not do. So now OODA looping, I would say the IC is part of that, yes, but a lot of the troubleshooting, mitigation, repair, and communicating outwards, making sure that you're giving those status updates, that you say, hey, I've done this remediation, or I'm about to start this remediation. These are things that you do in your local team.
Just for folks who may not have encountered it or aren't really thinking in these terms, can you give me an overview of what is that OODA loop?
Yeah, sure. I actually have, is it on the next slide? Oh yeah, it is. Cool. All right, so OODA loop is a process. It's a loop, and it's going to happen multiple times during an incident. It reminds me a lot of the idea of joint activity, because when humans are in joint activities, we're engaging in multiple micro and macrocosmic activities jointly, and they're looping. They're always starting and stopping, and they have a middle. So an OODA loop is the same. It starts and it stops, and it has a middle. And you're always doing it. So the very first part of this is the observe stage, where you're checking with things. You're assessing what they are. You're getting a picture of things. Evaluating, this is where you evaluate scope and severity. It's kind of the entry into the loop. Next, you're going to be orienting. That's the next O. And this is what we just talked about. Repairing common ground, recalibrating, bringing assumptions to the forefront so that they're squashed, getting on the same page, sharing mental models, all of these things that we're orienting ourselves around the incident. Now, what the incident commander helps to do is helps people decide. So the IC is in a particularly good place. When I say IC, I refer to the incident commander, to get diverse perspectives, allow the troubleshooters and the mitigators to do their job, and the IC can go out and ask other people for opinions, so that we get a lot of perspectives into making decisions. Informed decisions are better than rapid ones, which seems a little bit counterintuitive in an incident, but that's actually the better way to do things. And then the last part of the loop is to act. You're delegating the actions, you're updating each other, letting people know when the mitigations are made. Keeping changes to a minimum is something that I always think about when acting. Like, don't try to do like 3 different mitigations at the same time. Do one, see, that's why this loop repeats. And the last part of this that I really like, which kind of underlines the whole transparency aspect of things, is to use closed loop communication. Now, closed loop communication is like what you hear when you hear people on CBs, and they're talking back and forth and acknowledging what each other is saying. You'll hear, okay, roger that, or I heard that, or yes, I heard that. Or sometimes the closed loop communication is repeating what the other person said back to them. And then something like check or roger, go, whatever your nomenclature is on your team. So Yeah, short overview of the OODA loop. I think that's going to take us right into policies because, well, one of the things that I think about in policies, now we touched on policies a little bit when we talked about, um, spreading the love of the on-call program to the rest of the company. Now, one of the things that I've been dealing with recently in terms of aligning on policies is, well, how do we write the documentation so that there is a reference for it? How do we then train people to use the documentation, but then also train them to be poised to adapt? And then also, how do we build in compliance into this? Because policies, especially in companies where compliance controls are an important thing. You're a financial institution, or you host banks or anything like that. This is going to touch you. And so, Ty, do you have any good suggestions for how organizations can align on these policies?
I actually like the analogy that you were trying to develop earlier in the session, where you mentioned that there's a separate step of, you don't write the score and then you're done. I kind of think of policies in the same vein that ideally you need some period of time where things are in development, where we have a chance to say write and then practice and see how it fits. Also, I think the amount of policy and the degree of specification is going to vary for different needs. Like you said, if you have regulatory obligations where an auditor is going to ask you about the things, then obviously one of your first steps, your policies as written are going to be much more involved. Whereas if you don't have that constraint, your policies writing are going to be much more probably in the sort of like a handbook style. We do
Oh, yeah.
this. This is what it looks like, and believe it or not, you can call that policy. That's our policy. I tend to think of it as tendencies.
Mhm.
Depending on what you need, is you can think of policies as tendencies. What are some of the ideal things that you want to happen? While acknowledging the realities that can occur as well. I think writing from that perspective can help folks articulate a bit more broadly about the process than if you were just to say sort of describe in very exacting detail what the policy or process is.
Right, right. I love the tendencies. That's a great word. I the reason that I like tendencies is because we want to be flexible. So it doesn't make sense, as we were describing before, to try to categorize every single failure mode and then write your on-call policy around that thing. Run books are a thing that I think about in this space too, um, because the context is always different. Um, you know, Being able to have these policies that help guide the structure. This is the way I think about it. It's structure and form. A policy is a structure, okay? In music, a score is a structure. So when you look at a piece of music, and I'm talking about a piece of sheet music, I don't have one at hand here, but when you play that piece of music, I mean, you're making sound and you're doing things that they're not described in the score. They just aren't, because the performer is interpreting the score. And the interpretation from score to performance is an adaptation. It is being flexible with the confines of the score, and then you're creating the form of the music. And that's how I think about policies. The structure and the score that we have. Here's an example of one. So this is an example of a structure. This is a model. This is a form. I mean, a structure. Sorry. And it's just one example of identifying severity. And as you look at this, you can probably tell this is very prescriptive. It's extremely prescriptive. And it's like that for many different reasons. And this isn't a structure that we came up with from a book. We used how we operate to help guide the way that we built the structure. So now we have a structure that will help us do things in an incident, but the form of what the music is the incident itself and the response itself. So we may look at this, but we may have to make a decision about, a decision that many people make or have to try to make is the difference between Sev 1 and Sev 2. That's the difference between, do we work on it all night or are we only on it during business hours? So that may end up into a really gray area, because even though the severity might be a Sev 2, let's say, and we're only working on it during business hours, well, the priority may be really high. It's affecting like the VP of a company. So the priority is extremely high, but the severity may be just like, like he put in the wrong email, and so it kind of messed up and we had this bug or whatever, a really small severity technically, but we kind of have to blow up the model because the priority is so high. And then there's other things of dark debt that you may, and when I say dark debt, I mean the complexity enabled debt that you may never expect, and models just won't contain them. So you may get to something that just doesn't fit any of these categories, but is absolutely a Sev 0. So that'll happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you highlighted something very important there, which is, you said we didn't start with this and then start our behavior. We documented what our behavior and what was working was, and that's how we arrived at the policy.
Yeah. There's a really good book, Sidney Decker's most recent book, Compliance Capitalism. He talks about the idea of good rules and bad rules. And I think about this in that context. A good rule is typically a rule that is created by the people doing the work. So let's replace the word rule with model. If we go back to this model was created that way. It was created by the people doing the work. An example of a bad model would be work as imagined, where some other entity who never goes on call, who has never even touched code, decides that this is how we're going to structure it and this is how you're going to do it, without understanding our work is done. So yeah, that happens. The last thing that we want to talk about today is learning from incidents. Now, there's a lot. This is a huge topic. It's a topic of its own webinar. Trust me, multiples. But, there's a couple of things in learning from incidents that I think are really important. And one of those we already touched on a little bit, but it's the multiple perspectives and the story of the incident. In fact, we do a weekly operational review type of meeting. It started that way, actually, but we migrated it, metamorphosized it into what we call incident story time. And at incident story time, we're not looking at action items. Now, we may assign them. We may go, this is the defect. We need the team owning the defect to work on this. Please do. We may assign those action items, but what we're really looking for in that session is we look at our incidents from the past week, and we try, unless they had like their own special retrospective, we will go through them one by one and get the people who were working in the incidents their perspective. They tell their story of their handling of the incident. And wow, it's such a great session for us. We learn so much. It's not just what did we do bad and what did we do good. It's way beyond that. Ty, have you had any experiences in retrospectives or analyses or things like this where you have experienced good LFI techniques?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Some of the best that I've seen and been a part of are often very much like you say. They start from the basis of stories, from the basis of seeking multiple stories, not not to resolve everything into like one truth, but looking at things from how it unfolded for those people who were actually there. I think that almost every sort of practice or session I've been in is sort of grounded in that same thing, whether or not it was explicit or acknowledged. Is that any time it was the chance for people to share their own stories, their own perspective with the group, and have that kind of be observed and not sort of smashed how it can happen into one narrative. Getting those
Right.
multiple narratives has always been really valuable.
Yeah. It's, I would go so far as to say multiple narratives from multiple disciplines become valuable. Invite your salespeople to retrospectives, invite customer service people to retrospectives, invite your marketing people, invite your business development people. Just like the practice of practice stuff, the retrospectives are another case where we want diversity. Like we would rather have the diversity. A retrospective with all SREs will give us a great SRE perspective, but it's not going to give us a more broad perspective of things.
And this is an opportunity to, when you invite those folks, it helps you build more of that common ground we talked about earlier. And then they get a view into how your world looks, what your concern is. And then that way later too, maybe even then, but also later, if you have to go to someone and say, oh, we have this concern, they'll understand it. They'll have some context for it.
Yep. Right. I think we are coming up on time, Sarah. Are we?
Yeah, I will jump in, and I'll also just add, as a non-engineering member of the team, I'm always grateful to be involved in any sort of retrospective or conversation with our SRE team. I've learned since joining Blameless that reliability is a business problem, and anyone who cares about your software as a business, their perspective should be invited in to a learning from incidents.
Yeah, that's a great, thanks for adding that. I would also want to say that Sarah is actually one of the non-engineers that comes to our practice of practice sessions very regularly. So here's an example right here of the benefit of that.
If I could highlight something, I notice, and I'm presuming very carefully and accurately, that you folks are mentioning that some folks are non-engineers. I like that. Too often I hear folks say that other non-engineers are non-technical. And that's never true. There's so much complexity in our system at the human, at the process, at the compliance level, at all these things that we kind of need to work both ways, against it is getting folks involved in our world, getting an insight into theirs. I've never, in all the organizations I've worked with, seen a group of people who aren't technical. That technical skill may be in law, in policy, in quantitative analysis. It may be in a number of things that aren't computer code. But a lot of folks, I've always seen that folks are technical, and getting them in your retrospectives can help them see your concerns around, say, reliability. But also then you get a sense of what their concerns are when they look, or what their concerns are. If it seems like someone doesn't care about reliability, now you'll get insight into why. Well, it's because their concerns are over here. They didn't realize there was potentially a bridge. Like Sarah said, that reliability is a business problem. They maybe didn't realize that.
And we do have a question from a member of the audience on this particular topic.
Sure.
So the audience member asks, any guidance on communicating the importance of reliability or incident response work with stakeholders that do not have intrinsic grasp of these things, whether they're in growth or product centric? What would you say to this audience member?
I'd say pretty similarly to what we said. I would say maybe it doesn't have to be a retrospective if that doesn't work for you, if you don't have that yet and you want to talk to them kind of now. But I think broadly our recommendations stand of building that common ground, seeking their perspective, sharing yours, and as Sarah highlighted, finding that bridge that perhaps it's getting them to understand reliability is a business problem. Maybe reliability is a growth problem, because without reliability, it makes it really hard to grow. Or without reliability, it's hard to know what the right next step is for the product. Looking at it from their view and trying to communicate it and link it to the things they're aware of and ground it in some sort of shared understanding.
Yeah, I love that. And another word that I would use for this type of thing is building empathy and reciprocity. That's something that, Sarah, I think you've pointed out to me in the past. Just people don't know what SREs do. They don't realize what they have to put into their work. And if they're in a session, retrospective practice session or whatever, you gain more empathy for these people at the sharp end. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Great.
Any other questions, or I'm just checking out the chat here.
I have not seen any come in the last few minutes. We do have
Okay, great.
1 minute left if there is a final question from anyone in the audience. Any closing remarks from our hosts?
Ty, anything closing?
I would say if folks came to the session because they want to get started, they want to have an incident management program, my advice is going to be to start small. Know that you can change it later, that the value along the way is going to be in practicing it and in doing it, more than worrying about the right choice in the framework you pick or the way you write it. I would just encourage people to start and to practice and to keep going.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, don't be afraid to revise. It's going to happen. Don't think that you have to set this all up, like we were saying before. Set it all up, it's done, it's documented, and this is what we're going to do from now on. Don't think like that. We have a monthly review of our process. So have those reviews. Review your process and revise. If it doesn't work, do something else. Thank you everyone for joining today. Really appreciate the conversation. Ty, this has been an awesome session. Really just love talking with you about this stuff. It's near and dear to my heart. And thank you, Sarah, for coordinating and driving everything.
Yes.
Thank you both for having me.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, everyone who called in. We'll see you next time.
Yes.
Bye, folks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.